There are stories in this world that were never meant to reach your ears. Stories buried on purpose. Stories erased with intention. Some histories disappeared by accident, but others were removed because they revealed too much power, too much brilliance, too much strength coming from the people the world tried hardest to keep silent. This is the story of 5 black queens whose names echoed across continents, frightened empires, and shaped nations. And yet, somewhere along the way, those echoes were softened, twisted, and pushed out of sight. Not because their stories were unimportant, but because they were unstoppable. Long before Europe drew its first borders, these queens ruled ancient kingdoms with armies, with diplomacy, with wealth, with fire, with courage, with intelligence, with determination that shook the world. They were not myths. They were not legends built to inspire children. They were real women whose power was so undeniable that later generations tried to rewrite, shrink, or erase them to protect fragile narratives about who shaped the world. But the truth has a long memory. And today, that memory awakens. It begins along the Nile, in a land where hot winds carried stories across the desert, and pyramids rose from the sand like stone guardians. In this world lived a queen who refused to bow to the strongest empire on earth. Her name was Amanirenas, ruler of Kush. Her kingdom stood just south of Egypt, a land Rome believed it could swallow like every other region it conquered. Rome had marched across continents, crushing resistance with military might, discipline, and an almost divine belief that every corner of the earth belonged to them. To them, Kush was simply next, but to Amanirenas, Kush was everything: its people, its history, its sacred land. She took the throne at a time when Rome was tightening its grip on Egypt. Roman governors began pushing into Kushite territory, sending soldiers to scout, build, intimidate. Rome expected obedience. Rome expected tribute. Rome expected fear. But fear was something Amanirenas did not know. She was a queen raised in the tradition of warrior mothers, trained from youth to understand weapons, strategy, and the patterns of invading powers. She studied Rome not through the lens of worship, but through the eyes of someone who knew that even giants have weaknesses. And when that Roman governor demanded dominance over her people, she made a decision that few leaders dared to make. She struck first. It is said that when she marched with her army, the heat of the desert shimmered around her like a shield. Her soldiers moved with discipline carved from generations of warfare against Egypt, against desert raiders, against rival kingdoms. They crossed Roman outposts in a dust storm of power. What happened next was the moment Rome realized it had misjudged the South completely. Amanirenas and her forces attacked Roman positions with a fury the empire had not seen in years. They stormed forts, dismantled garrisons, removed Roman statues, and carved out their own declaration of strength. One Roman official famously wrote that the Kushites fought with surprising skill and incredible courage. But Roman writers, of course, avoided mentioning the woman who led them. Her resistance grew so strong that Rome, frustrated and humiliated, sent thousands of soldiers to punish her. This was the empire that crushed Carthage, that defeated Greek armies, that expanded from one sea to another. Rome expected an easy victory, but Amanirenas refused to be conquered. She fought in battle herself, standing at the front lines, proving to her people that a queen's place was not behind palace walls, but beside her soldiers. In one fierce clash, she lost an eye to a Roman arrow, but even that didn't break her. She simply wore the wound as a mark of her devotion, a reminder that Kush would rise or fall with her strength. Rome tried to overwhelm her kingdom again and again, but Amanirenas used strategy that Rome didn't expect. Hit-and-run attacks, night moves, shock assaults, psychological warfare. Her armies knew the desert far better than Rome's heavily armored soldiers. They used the land, the heat, and the silence to their advantage. They fought not for expansion, not for glory, but for survival, for the idea that their children should grow up free. The war lasted years. Rome grew exhausted, drained, and embarrassed. For the first time in a long time, the empire faced an opponent who simply refused to surrender. Eventually, negotiations began. But this was not a defeated queen begging for mercy. Amanirenas refused to kneel, refused to pay tribute, refused to bow to empire. The final peace treaty required Rome to withdraw from Kushite lands entirely. And it stood as one of the few times Rome backed down from an African kingdom. But when later historians wrote about Rome's victories, her name faded from their pages. They wrote about Roman bravery, Roman strategy, Roman strength. Her story became a whisper, a footnote, a line of text. Because the truth was uncomfortable. A black queen had forced the greatest empire of its era to step back. Her power terrified them, and that is why she was erased. As the desert winds carried the echoes of Amanirenas across the centuries, another queen's story rose far to the east, across trade routes and ancient mountains. Her name was Makeda, known to some as the Queen of Sheba. Her story was twisted into myth, into legend, into poetry. But beneath the layers of fantasy lies a real African monarch whose influence touched continents. Makeda ruled a kingdom that controlled some of the most valuable trade corridors of the ancient world. Her realm connected the riches of Africa, gold, incense, spices, precious stones, with the bustling markets of Arabia and lands beyond. Caravans under her protection stretched across deserts like moving gold rivers. Her decisions influenced global trade long before the idea of Europe as a center of the world even existed. But so much of her story was buried beneath religious symbolism and rewritten stories that made her seem like a side character rather than a powerful leader. They turned her into a figure who existed only to admire the wisdom of a foreign king. They ignored the possibility that she visited as an equal, or even as someone whose wealth and power surpassed that of many ancient rulers. The truth is this: Makeda's journey across the desert was not a romantic tale. It was a political move of extraordinary brilliance. She traveled with a massive entourage: soldiers, advisors, servants, merchants, and treasure-bearers. Her arrival in foreign courts was not the entrance of a curious woman seeking guidance. It was the entrance of a queen who sought diplomatic relationships, who measured nations not by their myths, but by their potential alliances. Her wealth stunned every kingdom she visited. Her intellect was described as sharp, and her presence was said to command silence the moment she entered a room. Makeda was not a guest. She was a negotiator. She understood that diplomacy could build stronger empires than war. She understood that respect and fear often walk side by side. And she understood that her kingdom, rich, powerful, and strategically placed, needed to be recognized on the world stage. But as time passed, her story was retold by outsiders who struggled to imagine a black woman wielding that kind of influence. They softened her strength, turned her power into myth, and shifted the focus away from her achievements. They made her unreal so they could deny the reality of her leadership. Yet her legacy lived on in her descendants, in her culture, in the architecture of her kingdom, and in the memory of people who never forgot her true power. Makeda was a queen whose presence shaped regions, and erasing her from history meant erasing the evidence that Africa was once home to some of the most advanced and wealthy civilizations on Earth. But Africa's queens were not only rulers of trade. Some were warriors who fought foreign invaders with spirit, wit, and determination. And no story represents that fierce fire better than the life of Queen Nzinga. While Makeda used diplomacy as her weapon, Nzinga used both diplomacy and war, shifting between them with terrifying skill. She ruled the kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba, in the region known today as Angola. Her enemies were not ancient empires like Rome, but European colonizers who had come with guns, priests, and hunger for land and human lives. When the Portuguese sought to dominate her land and force her people into the slave trade, Nzinga stepped forward not just as a ruler, but as a strategist. She met with their governors in negotiations that would have crushed an inexperienced leader. Instead, she arrived with poise, intelligence, and the calm of someone who understood power far better than her adversaries did. There is a famous moment from her life that reveals everything about her ability to read a room. When she entered a meeting with the Portuguese, they intentionally refused to provide her a chair, hoping to force her to sit on the ground like a subordinate. It was an insult meant to break her dignity. Nzinga refused to be humiliated. She motioned toward one of her attendants, who immediately dropped to their hands and knees. She sat on their back, not as an act of arrogance, but as a statement. No one decides my position but me. The room fell silent, because the Portuguese understood exactly what she was saying. For decades, Nzinga fought colonizers through diplomacy, shifting alliances, and war. She built connections with neighboring kingdoms and with escaped enslaved Africans. She formed communities in forests and mountains that became safe zones for people fleeing enslavement. She led armies well into her 60s, often riding at the front lines. Her strategies frustrated the Portuguese so deeply that they wrote letters complaining about her unpredictable intelligence and ability to rally people. The Europeans painted Nzinga as violent, savage, dangerous. Yet this was the same language used against any black leader who refused enslavement. In truth, her fight was not about violence. It was about survival, sovereignty, and dignity. She protected her people from being swallowed by foreign rule, and she resisted until the very end of her life. But European writers later twisted her story, reducing her leadership to anecdotes and half-remembered details. They wanted the world to forget that a black queen outsmarted colonizers using strategies still studied by military historians today. But not all queens fought invaders with armies. Some fought empires with words, unity, and the unshakable spirit of a mother defending her children. In West Africa, in the land of the Asante, lived a queen mother whose courage sparked one of the most powerful uprisings against the British Empire. Her name was Yaa Asantewaa. She was not born into war. She was not raised to lead armies. She lived most of her life as a farmer, a woman of her community, someone who valued peace. But when the British exiled her king, took control of her land, and demanded the sacred golden stool, a symbol of Asante pride and identity, she rose not because she wanted power, but because no one else would. As the men debated whether to fight, whether to negotiate, whether to retreat, Yaa Asantewaa stood up and spoke words that would ignite a nation. "If you men will not fight, then we the women will. We will fight until the last of us falls." Her voice carried a force that made even the elders pause. So she became the unexpected leader of the Asante War of the Golden Stool, a queen mother with no military training, guiding an entire nation into battle. But power does not always come from experience. Sometimes it comes from purpose. Under her leadership, the Asante fought with such determination that the British were stunned. They expected fear. Instead, they encountered bravery so strong that even British commanders wrote about how impressed and frustrated they were. Yaa Asantewaa coordinated defenses, inspired warriors, and became the heart of a resistance movement that refused to let their identity be stolen. She was eventually captured and exiled, but the British never forgot her. They feared her influence even from a distance. They feared her name, her memory, her courage. And so her story faded from their books, not erased completely, but softened, minimized, reshaped to make her seem less threatening. But her people never forgot her spirit. She became a symbol of resistance, of womanhood, of national pride. And her legacy remains a reminder that even the quietest voices can become a storm when justice is on the line. Far from the lands of the Asante, across the sea on the island of Madagascar, another queen stood at the crossroads of history. While the world around her bent under colonial pressure, she refused to surrender her nation's independence. Her name was Ranavalona, a queen both feared and misunderstood. Ranavalona inherited a kingdom facing immense pressure from European powers who wanted Madagascar's land, resources, and people. She recognized the danger immediately. If she allowed foreigners to control even small parts of her nation, everything could collapse. Culture, economy, sovereignty. So she made a choice many rulers feared to make. She pushed out foreign influence entirely. She strengthened her army, tightened borders, and enforced policies that kept her nation's affairs in the hands of her people, not outsiders. Her rule was firm, sometimes harsh, but her main goal never changed. Madagascar would not become anyone's colony. Under her leadership, the island remained free from European rule for over 3 decades. She balanced diplomacy and force with a carefulness that confused and frustrated foreign observers. Europeans wrote vicious stories about her, calling her monstrous, dangerous, cruel. Yet these were the same voices that twisted any African ruler who refused surrender into a villain. They feared her strength. They feared her independence. They feared the example she set for other African kingdoms that might dare to resist colonization. For 33 years, Madagascar remained unconquered because of her. But when European writers later reshaped the narrative, they painted her in the harshest colors possible, ignoring the truth behind her actions. She was a woman fighting for sovereignty at a time when colonial empires swallowed entire nations without hesitation. Her story was twisted because it threatened the idea that Africa was too weak to defend itself. These 5 queens, Amanirenas, Makeda, Nzinga, Yaa Asantewaa, and Ranavalona, lived in different ages, ruled different lands, and fought different battles. Yet they all faced the same fate. The world tried to erase them. Why? Because they disrupted the comfortable lie that Africa was always powerless. They destroyed the narrative that black women never led, never commanded, never influenced the world. Their stories proved something that colonial powers didn't want to admit. Africa was home to warriors, diplomats, strategists, rulers, empire builders, and leaders whose brilliance shaped history. And when you erase a queen, you erase the memory of a kingdom. That is why their names were buried. That is why their victories were quieted. That is why their legacies were softened. But here you are, watching, listening, learning, reclaiming. You are helping their names rise again. Because history is not a straight line. It is a circle. It returns when people are ready to hear it. And now that you know these queens, their stories become part of your memory. Their strength becomes part of your knowledge. Their courage becomes part of your understanding of what Africa contributed to the world. So here is what you can do. Share this video. Spread these names. Comment which queen shocked you the most. Tell me which hidden rulers you want next. And subscribe, because this channel will keep bringing you the stories the world wanted to hide. They tried to erase these queens, but today, you brought them back, and their power will never fade again.